Die meeste Suid-Afrikaners bly steeds in rasgedefinieerde woonbuurte en townships. Swart mense woon boonop meestal aan die buitewyke van die stede, ver van hulle plekke van werk. Hoe moeilik is dit om ons stede meer geïntegreerd te maak? Is dit sosiale manipulasie of 'n voorvereiste vir die normalisering van ons gemeenskap? Ek gesels nou hieroor met professor Sarah Charlton van Wits. Hello, Sarah.
Good evening.
I just looked at some aerial maps of our cities, and it's up on the screen now, and every color depicts a different race. A fairly shocking picture. 24 years after apartheid formally ended, how did we end up here? Did the town planners and the city planners simply go on in the same mold after 1994?
So I come from a town planning department and I would like to defend the planners a little bit, but it's true that we are in a shocking position and it really shouldn't be as those maps show currently. I think it was well recognised before the ending of apartheid and in the 90s that we really needed to do something quite drastic to change our apartheid spatial pattern. And there were a series of mechanisms and policies put in place to try and do things differently. So it's a very good question as to why is it that those haven't actually succeeded. So if I can maybe just give an example of a kind of mechanism that we were trying to go for. So our policy documents definitely say we need to restructure the apartheid city. We need to reintegrate race groups, income groups. We need to create a more inclusive city. And mechanisms would be doing things like putting low-income housing in old apartheid buffer strips, those empty pieces of land between a white area and a coloured area, for example. So to do something like that. Also to improve public transport, to connect disconnected places. So we've tried to do bits and pieces of that, and there are a few success stories around that. But I suppose the short answer as to why we haven't done better is because there's some big forces and counter trends pushing in different directions, basically. And perhaps I can give you some examples of those.
Private sector forces.
Some of them are private sector forces. Maybe somewhat ironically, perhaps some of our own policies have had unintended consequences. So something like the housing program, the low-income housing program, the RDP housing program, there's been a big push to deliver big numbers of housing because there's been such a demand, such a shortfall, so many people protesting, asking for their house. And the easiest and quickest way to do that is on big, uncontested pieces of land, which tend to be on the edges of cities. If you try and do the more complicated infill development, maybe somebody's going to object.
Although there are quite big tracts of land inside the cities, I think of Cape Town where I live, Easterplaat and Oudemoor and all those places, and they untouched. In fact, District 6 is still an open wound.
Yes, yes.
So that's complete government inaction.
Yes, yes. Well, something like District 6 and the places where their land claims are particularly contested and tricky places to sort out. But some of the other areas, I mean, I think the reality is that there are people with vested interests and property owners, the haves, are not particularly welcoming to perhaps the have-nots being in close proximity. And so there's contestations around that sort of land. There are objections. So when the city, and I'm thinking of an example in Johannesburg, tries to do something like create a social housing project in a middle-income area, perhaps a formerly white area, there might be all sorts of objections, not put forward on the basis of race. It won't be as explicit as that, but it might be to do with things like environmental objections or traffic objections or something like that. And those don't necessarily win, those objections, but they
those are not
delay.
Those are not all completely unreasonable. I mean, to most, I suspect most people watching this would say, my home is my only asset, and I can't afford its property, my property's value, to be devalued by any kind of development. That is a fairly reasonable thing. I mean, that is a fear all over the world when you're talking about inclusive cities.
Yes.
How do you address that?
That's true, and I'm a property owner and I would have the same sorts of concerns, probably. I mean, I think one of the ways to address it is basically to say that everywhere has to transform. We all have to change, all of our suburbs, so that particular neighbourhoods don't feel picked on, like their particular properties are going to be devalued, but that we all have to accept that change has to come throughout middle-class neighbourhoods, upper-income neighbourhoods, and it's part of all of our responsibility to kind of share this change.
Are there examples in the world where this has really worked? I'm thinking of Berlin, where I once lived in Kreuzberg, and it was very black. And now it's rich and poor live very close to each other in fair amount of harmony.
Yeah, I think there are many examples where that has happened. It often takes a while, and of course cities go through phases and neighbourhoods go through phases of change where gentrification happens, poor people are pushed out, but then the neighbourhood changes and things come back. I think it's less easy to do it in a kind of very deliberate manner, which is what we need to do to change our apartheid cities. And we need to do things very consciously, and I think we all need to be part of the project. We all need to internalise the message that it's not someone else's problem, it's not government's problem to sort this out on the edges of cities somewhere far away. It's not government's problem just to respond to poor people in the localities where they currently are. It's all of our responsibility to understand that we have to change, our neighbourhoods have to change, and that's not a terrible thing, it's a good thing.
Yeah, that's the point I was about to make. There's something in it for everybody, because the word I earlier used was we will normalise our society. If you live in a lily-white suburb and across the railway line there's a slum, it's not nice for you to live like that. So we can all gain if it's done properly.
I think so. I think it's hard to persuade all of us that there are benefits for everybody. And unfortunately, the trend in our cities is towards more exclusion, more insular kind of living, into the kind of gated communities, the boomed off neighbourhoods, the kind of turning our backs. And one can sort of understand some of that, driven by fear of crime or crime. But I think part of it is also maybe wanting some kind of respite from the relentlessness of the difficult society in which we live. And so this idea that one can sort of hide away somewhere. But really research across the world is showing and trying to promote the idea that inclusive neighbourhoods are better for everybody. There's definitely research showing that for poorer children, growing up in a mixed income neighbourhood is better, having better access to multiple resources in things like libraries, in community facilities. The economic opportunities that might be presented in a mixed income neighbourhood is definitely better for everyone. The difficult issue is how do we try and work against very strong trends which are going the other way. And it's not just in South Africa, it's across the world. This isolationist fear of the other, withdrawal is really part of what we're seeing everywhere. And
it's not only a question of normalising society or human dignity or human rights. There are also economic consequences. I mean, again, back to Cape Town where I live, people travel for hours from where they live to where they work, and then we have a rail system that doesn't function properly. So there are economic consequences of having workers living 30, 40, 50 kilometres away from their jobs.
Absolutely, and those are severe economic consequences for those particular households. Figures in South Africa show that poor households have to spend really quite a disproportionate amount of their money on travel costs, but also travel time, which has enormous impact on ability to look after children properly, etc. And those households really are prevented from thriving, from using the job that they do have as a platform for betterment, because so much is expended on the difficult, expensive journey. I mean, what we're finding in Johannesburg, some quite interesting research is showing that some of the people who are sleeping rough, some of the people who are sleeping in parks, in public spaces in the city are not necessarily what you might expect, a down-and-out vagrant, which is our common perception of such a person, but actually is someone trying to hold down a job, but someone who can't actually afford a commute on a daily basis, or someone for whom living in a house on the edge of the Gauteng area just doesn't work for a job in a well-located bit of Joburg. And so they're having to make those kind of compromises, which are extremely difficult, and a huge indictment on our society that should be happening.
What solutions are there in the short term? Because long, medium term, we don't have time for that anymore. What can we do quickly to alleviate this? Government has a plan of taking state land and carving it up and dishing it out. Are those the kind of things we can do quickly?
I think what we need to be doing is multiple strategies to many different things. I don't think there's one big magic bullet, but a couple of examples of what we could be doing. So the city of Johannesburg, for example, at the moment is trying to put in place an inclusionary housing policy, which basically says that for every new development, residential development over a certain size, a certain percentage of that needs to be for low-income people. Now, this policy is contested. Developers are not very happy with it, but there's been quite a process of trying to modify, trying to work around some of the objections, and I think something like that is a very good way to go. So that's one thing. Then in addition, the city councils can actually build cheap rental accommodation in well-located parts of the city. These are for working people, for decent working people who are trying to make a living. So that would be another strategy. And then I think for the very low-income person, we need overnight shelters. We've got a huge homelessness problem in all of our cities, and it's growing very rapidly.
Sarah, thank you very much. Bly ingeskakel, ons is net hierna terug.